This morning, we're going to be in Luke 24, and it's verses 13 through 35. And this is one of I guess there's a lot of favorite passages in the Bible, but I love this passage. And so I'll read it for us. Now that very day, two of them, these are disciples. These two disciples were on their way to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and debating these things, Jesus himself approached and began to accompany them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Then he said to them, "What are these matters you are discussing so intently as you walk along?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened in these days?" He said to them, "What things?" "The things concerning Jesus the Nazarene," they replied, "a man who with his powerful deeds and words proved to be a prophet before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was going to be the one who was going to redeem Israel. Not only this, but it is now the third day since these things have happened. Furthermore, some women of our group amazed us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back and said they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." So he said to them, "You foolish people, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures. So they approached the village where they were going. He acted as though he wanted to go further, but they urged him, "Stay with us because it's getting toward evening and the day is almost done." So he went in to stay with them. When he had taken his place at the table with them, he took the bread, he blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. At this point, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Then he vanished out of their sight. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us when he was speaking with us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" So they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those with them gathered together and saying, "The Lord has really risen, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how they recognized him when he broke the bread. It's interesting how the story ends because you have a couple of excited guys. We're going to come back and we know that Jesus is risen. And they come back to the 11 and the 11 are like, "Hey, did you know Jesus is risen? He appeared to Peter." And it's like the wind kind of goes out of their sails. You can just kind of imagine how they may have felt like, "Man, we wanted to break the news. We thought we were the cool ones." But then the 11 are like, "Yeah, we already know about that now." But it's cool that they got to reminisce and they got to talk about this. And the story, it's a lengthy story to read. It's the first of 3 post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And this is one of the longest stories in Luke. And so with being one of the longest stories, I believe that Luke, he wants us to learn some important things from this. There's a reason he put so many words into this and so much detail. And when we went through the writings of John, we talked about how beautiful John's writing is, how amazing just how he structures his wording is. But here you can find that John is not alone in writing amazing stories and telling us about the life of Jesus. You can picture this in your head the way Luke writes it. 2 disciples. Their hope is crushed. And they're walking along, and it says that they were debating. They were like, what are we to make of this, basically? And so you can picture this in your head as they're just trudging along. Man, what do we do? Our hope is crushed. It's day 3. And so confusion is stacked on top of the loss of hope. And they're trying to figure out, what do we make of the women's report of the tomb? Where's Jesus' body? And it's interesting that in this story, one of the great things that I love is in the middle of lost hope and in the middle of confusion, that's when Jesus comes. And as a reader of this story, when Luke wrote this, many readers would have heard this, and they might have known about, Jesus is resurrected from the dead, but the story is made to build anticipation. And so for the reader, if you're living out the story, you don't know that Jesus is alive yet. And so up to this point in the story, we've heard that maybe Jesus is alive. The women say that the tomb was empty. There's a rumor that Jesus has risen from the dead. But as you're going through the story, there's this anticipation. Is he really risen from the dead? And at this moment, if you were immersed in this as a reader, you would have been excited. Jesus really is alive. Jesus just came to these people. But despite us as a reader knowing that this is Jesus, what we find is these disciples didn't recognize him. And what the wording here is that it's actually not a supernatural blockage that prevented them from recognizing him. It says their eyes were prevented from recognizing him, but eyes in the Bible and through Luke, eyes relate to understanding. Understanding, you can even go back to the story of Adam and Eve. And they commit the sin, and then their eyes are opened to understand that they were naked, and they felt ashamed. And so eyes relate to understanding. And so what Luke is saying here is that their own issues with understanding are preventing them from recognizing Jesus. The idea here is that they wouldn't have even known to be looking for Jesus. They were so confused and they lacked the understanding. They may have even argued as Jesus is walking towards them, man, that guy looks like Jesus. And then the guy could have been like, don't be an idiot. He's dead. The body's missing. And the guy's like, you're right. It can't be Jesus, but man, it could be his twin. And so what you're getting from this is this idea that they lacked understanding to even know to look for Jesus. And so the point of Luke here is not that they were supernaturally blocked from seeing Jesus, not that Jesus looked different than how he looked before. But when Luke references to the eyes, it's that these guys didn't even understand they should be looking for Jesus. And so because they had no room for something like this, it didn't matter how much this guy may have even looked like Jesus. He couldn't be Jesus. They wouldn't have thought that he would even be Jesus. And instead of thinking that they would see Jesus again, they talked about how they had hoped that Jesus would have been the one to redeem Israel. They're talking in all past tense. They had hoped he would be the one to overthrow the Romans and save Israel from their captivity to the Roman Empire. And notice how far we're in the story of the Bible. And still, people are living out in real time the lack of understanding of how God is going to come in power and what it looks like. It doesn't look like the world's style. It doesn't look like overthrowing an empire. And so you have the Hebrew Bible from Genesis. You have the passages we've looked at in Isaiah, where it talked about God rolling up his sleeve and he's going to come in power. And then the next chapter talks about the suffering servant. That's how God coming in power looks. The last time we met 2 weeks ago, we looked at John, and Jesus coming into his glory is Jesus being lifted up on a cross. And so there's all of this imagery, and yet people still aren't getting it. They're looking for that world style power. And they're like, we thought Jesus was going to be the one to bring that to us. And this is important for us because we see how much they miss it. But if we continue to think that God's power looks like world power, to this day, we're still going to miss the move of God. What I want to focus on in this story today, there's a ton of stuff here. I want to focus on how Jesus brings his disciples to see him for who he is. First, Jesus goes over the whole story with them. We're told that Jesus takes them all the way back to Moses. To say that he took them all the way back to Moses is to say that he took them back to the first 5 books of the Bible. And then it says he took them to the prophets too. And the prophets are not just the prophetic books like we would picture it. But in the Hebrew Bible, the prophetic books are also Kings and Samuel. It's histories, it's stories. And so Jesus takes them all the way back to the beginning of the story, and he tells them the story because they don't understand how it's supposed to be. And so as they walk along the way, Jesus is working through the story. He's like, let me tell you the story and tell you why things were supposed to work out the way they did. And we find out how well Jesus tells the story because later they reminisce. When he told the story, weren't our hearts, didn't they burn within us? This is a way to say like, our emotions were stirred. Any good story should stir your emotions. And so Jesus was telling this story, and of course, the story about God and creation and how he's working through history should stir our emotions probably more than any other story. And so like any amazing story, Jesus takes them back to the beginning and he tells the story, and they feel the emotion pulled in. He talked about our hearts burned within us. And Jesus tells the story of Scripture to these 2 disciples. And it stirs them emotionally. But at the end of the story, when the disciples reach their destination, they still don't understand. Jesus covered the entire story. He took them all the way back to Moses and the prophets. And as they're walking, you as the reader would be like, great, Jesus is going to explain this, and they're going to understand. But again, if this is like any good movie, it has a cliffhanger. And they reach their destination and Jesus is going to keep on going. And as a reader, you're like, no, your disciples don't understand yet. You haven't explained it well enough. Something's wrong. Your disciples don't understand. And so Luke writes in an excellent manner that would have had his audience on the edge of their seats. Oh man, these people don't understand that Jesus is with them. And now Jesus is gracing them with, could you imagine Jesus explaining the Bible stories? I would love to hear that, of him talking through the Bible. And you as the reader are like, and they still don't get it. What's wrong with these people? And so Jesus is going to continue on. And you as the reader realize the disciples may just miss out on this chance to understand that they're really talking to Jesus and to truly understand where the whole story of Scripture was going. But the disciples at the last minute do the hospitable thing. It's getting late. We have a place to stay. Come on in with us. And so you as the reader are like, okay, there's still time. There's still time for them to get this, right? And Jesus accepts their invitation. And so you're like, whew, his disciples haven't missed out yet. And having read this, we know what happens. Jesus comes in, and as he blesses and breaks, and he passes the bread, that's the missing piece that makes everything click. And Luke says their eyes were opened. To have your eyes opened is to come to an understanding. And they understood whose presence they were in. And so it's the missing piece here. And it doesn't say that Jesus disappeared instantly. He could have broken the bread, handed it to them, and he could have shared the bread with them. He could have stayed. But it does say then at some point, Jesus disappears. And one of the interesting things here is that as Jesus disappears, he leaves them with table community. He leaves them with a meal. He leaves them with community. And so it's almost this understanding that Luke offers us, that it's in community that Jesus is really still with us. He's really not gone. Jesus offers this and then he leaves. But this is what we have to continue on. And so I think that Jesus, in this, he demonstrates one of the most important things that I would hope to build in a church. Jesus gave these people the entire spiel. He went through the Bible. He went back to Moses and the prophets, and he gave them the entire story. He's like, let me go back to square one and explain this to you. This is things that we often try to do. Apologetics is an entire school of thought to give the spiel to people. And so Jesus does this, and he gives them the spiel, and it doesn't work. And it wasn't until he sat down and lived life with them that things clicked. He shared some bread, and they understood who he was. And so this is what I would hope to instill in any church. We can do like Jesus. It's great to explain the Bible to people. It's great to give them the spiel. But I believe we can talk until we're blue in the face. And there's a piece that's still needed. And I think that it's not until we do life as Jesus with people that all the pieces really come together. And so it's not just words. The words are great. Jesus built on the words. He talked to them the whole walk. But those things didn't click until Jesus sat down and shared life. And so that would be my hope to instill in a church. That would be my hope to instill in this church, is the doing life part. Jesus told these two disciples that the entire story of the Bible was all about him. He went through Moses and the prophets. He would have talked about creation. He would have talked about the flood. He would have talked about the Exodus. He would have talked about David as king, Solomon as king. He would have talked about all of these things. He would have said, this all points to me. And then what he did is he lived out the story with his life. We talked 2 weeks ago about the gospel and about how there is a difficulty to define the gospel. And the reason it's difficult to define the gospel is because the gospel is not defined in a sentence or two. The gospel was defined by a life. The gospel was defined by Jesus' life. And so I think this is our call, to continue narrating the story with our lives, just as Jesus did. When I read this story, to me, that's the amazing piece that I feel can often be missing, is to join people in communion around a table, is to join people in those moments of life. I haven't just given you the words and now Jesus is going to move on. I gave you the words, you got to figure it out and then move on. I've given you the words, and now as you invite me in, I'll have life with you. And the words become lived out, and the words become meaningful. To me, when I read this story, it's an amazing testament, an amazing close to Jesus' life. If you read through the other remaining appearances of Christ, it's the same thing. Peter, he denied Christ 3 times. And Jesus doesn't come back and say, it's okay because, and then he goes into theology. I went on the cross and I died for your sins. And so I died for your 3 times. You sinned 3 times. You denied me 3 times. And I died for that. And so it's okay. It's water under the bridge. Instead, what Jesus does is he comes and he meets them after they're fishing. And he pulls Peter in. And he shares fish and he loves Peter. He talks to Peter. And so for me, it's that life. It's that living with people. So it's an amazing close to Jesus' life, I believe, to show that it's just not theology. It's about living a life.